Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today we will be reviewing every single full-length studio album from legendary 80s extreme metal pioneers and icons, Celtic Frost. There's a solid chance that maybe some of the younger peeps watching this video may not know who Celtic Frost is, and honestly, I'm not gonna give you shit. That's totally fair. They're not really talked about in the same regard as, say, Megadeth, or Metallica, or Iron Maiden, or Ozzy Osbourne, or any other number of, mega monumentally popular and successful metal acts that emerged out of the 80s. But I would argue that Celtic Frost is, in many ways, as influential, and definitely also in many ways, just as badass, maybe even more so. There is so much happening in thrash, death, black, and avant-garde metal that you can trace back to stuff that Celtic Frost was doing on their biggest hits in the 1980s. And though Celtic Frost is no longer with us, their brand of darkness and weirdness and full-on brutality continues to exist through other projects like Triptychon, featuring Tom G. Warrior of Celtic Frost fame. So today we're going to do a deep dive into their discography. We're going to talk about all 6 of their full-length studio albums. As per the norm with these types of videos, I am not interested in EPs, demos, live albums, or compilations, and as tempting as it is to talk about Triptychon because they are also awesome, I should note I'm not interested for the sake of this video in anything that Triptychon or any other kind of Celtic Frost side project might have put out. We are focused on Celtic Frost and Celtic Frost alone because they are badass and cool and great, and I need an excuse to talk about them because we just don't really talk about them a lot here, which is a real shame. First up, we have Morbid Tales, released in November 1984 via Noise Records, Enigma Records, and Metal Blade Records. I should note right off the bat, this was, at the time of its release, considered an EP. It has only been in retrospect that it has been considered an album, an LP. I should also note that there are a couple different versions of this album slash EP slash whatever the flying hell you want to fucking call it. For the purposes of this video, I will be looking specifically at the North American LP version, which is the one you will find primarily on streaming services or if you wanted to buy it in a record store or something like that. This record is a primitive, crusty, dark, uncompromising blast of, I guess, what we would now call black metal, or I don't know, if you want to be super specific, blackened thrash or speed metal or whatever the fuck. In the mid-80s, they just called it metal. They didn't have all these fucking subgenres and labels and shit. The point is, it's pretty unapologetically hellish and nasty. All of the things that you would want from, say, a really dark, fucked up black metal record, or really any kind of, atypical extreme metal release from the 80s. It does unintentionally feel somewhat generic and derivative, not by design, more so by default. The fact is, this is a remarkably simplistic album, and yes, while it may have been revolutionary and inspiring in its time, the fact is, nowadays, there's tons of stuff that sounds just like this, and I think as a result, this album has lost a little bit of its luster and appeal and unique vibe, shall we say. That aside, removing my dumb, pretentious, fucking hipster critic hat for a second, this record is just also flat out fun. It's got a lot of attitude and a lot of great riffs, and it doesn't waste any fucking time whatsoever. Tracks like Into the Crypts of Rage, Dethroned Emperor, Procreation of the Wicked, the title track, Morbid Tales, they all remain bona fide classics and ragers. And, looking back at this album, it's kind of interesting to see these, slightly weirder flashes, these weirder, more atmospheric moments and textures that, we would later expect from Celtic Frost on other records that come pretty shortly after this. It's essentially expanding upon everything that Hellhammer did, another band featuring former members of Celtic Frost, and taking that into darker, heavier, more varied territory, with better production, a little bit more money behind the scenes, a little bit more spit and polish. by no means the mind-blowing spectacle now that it was back in the day. I don't even think that's really an unfair thing to say, but I would still recommend this album. I would still give it like a 3.5 out of 5. I still think it's a really good record from start to finish, all things considered, and I think anyone looking to brush up on their heavy metal, extreme metal history owes it to themselves to listen to this record at least once. Next up, we have Ethereon, released in October 1985 via Noise Records, and I really don't think it's going to be controversial for me to say that this is Celtic Frost's best record. Their most cohesive, their most powerful, their strongest from start to finish, undeniably one of the most influential extreme metal records of the 1980s. This more so than anything else in the Celtic Frost discography. You know, you can look at this and you can see like where so many black metal and death metal bands got so much of their inspiration from. The songs are heavier, meaner, nastier, faster. They're also moodier, more dramatic, more progressive. We have these like totally razor-sharp, demented forays of like spastic black metal, death metal, thrash metal insanity, but we also have these surprisingly quite lush, evocative, almost gothic orchestral arrangements with like French horns and all these different vocal patterns. It just has this very ominous and consuming feel. To say that the album sounds dark and brutal almost feels like a disservice. This album sounds, and I have to assume was, like it was recorded in a pit of lost souls, in a dark cavern in the middle of nowhere. You have songs like The Usurper, Jewel Throne, Circle of Tyrants, which just go so crazy fucking hard. And you have stuff like Necromantical Screams and Dawn of Megiddo, which, you know, have this real cinematic quality to them. Like, there's a lot of scope and scale and weight to these numbers, French horns, and like, very like spooky, eerie backing vocals contrasted with these slower, more methodical, more dramatic arrangements. The opening number, Innocence in Wrath 2, just fills me with so much dread every time I hear it. Side note, perhaps an argument needs to be made that Celtic Frost also paved the way for some doom, because I hear a lot of doom here. I mean, I know, you know, this is kind of in the same time period where doom metal is starting to become kind of sort of a thing. I don't know, just a thought, throwing that out there. Do with that information whatever you wish. For me, this is a solid 4.5 out of 5. I think it holds up extremely well. I think this is Celtic Frost's best album, and I get the feeling I won't get too much pushback on that. Like, this is pretty universally loved, so yeah, cool. Next up, we have Into the Pandemonium, released in June 1987 via Noise Records and Combat Records, and now we're starting to see Celtic Frost get a little bit more expressive, get a little bit more weird and funky and experimental. They are pulling some more influence from like classic hard rock and heavy metal. They're building on the successes of Ethereon as well, retaining some of those classical, some of those gothic, black and death metal elements. They're also throwing in like some weirder shit, and they're also just kind of doing weirder shit. I mean, for God's sakes, the album opens with a cover of Mexican Radio. There's also one in there, Pride, which is an industrial song built around various samples taken from the Apollo program. There's also a bunch of songs that take lyrics directly from classic poetry. Rex Irae, which is the first part in a 3-part series, which up until 2019 was not technically finished. Inside and Out, a way more ambitious record. That much is for certain. What's most impressive about this record is that it is able to be as ambitious as it is without detracting from what previously made Celtic Frost so engaging and so entertaining. Like, even in this album's weirdest moments, I'm still fucking rocking with it, the same way I was rocking with Morbid Tales and Ethereon. I mean, stuff like Mesmerize, Inner Sanctum, despite some of the more theatrical vocal work, great stuff that wouldn't be out of place on Ethereon. I like Sorrows of the Moon, which goes into more melodramatic and gothic territory. I Won't Dance, which feels like a really ironic twist on that kind of like new wave post-punk vibe, but emboldened by extreme metal of the time. This is Celtic Frost just being like really super artsy-fartsy and fucking weird, and it kind of works for them. For me, I think this would be a 4 to 5. I understand why somebody wouldn't like this, especially if you're coming straight from Morbid Tales or even Ethereon and you're expecting just straight up like black metal, death metal brutality. This, I imagine, for that reason, was a more controversial record back in the day. But I don't know, fuck it, I love it. I think it has stood the test of time, and I think it is a great record. Next up, we have Cold Lake, released in September 1988 via Noise Records, and wow, where do I even begin with this absolutely legendary fuck-up of an album? When we talk about the worst metal albums of all time, there are a few albums that are almost always brought into the conversation. Saint Anger from Metallica, Illa Divinum Insanus from Morbid Angel, and Cold Lake from Celtic Frost. This album has kind of a fascinating history to it. So the story goes that Celtic Frost briefly disbanded after touring in support of their previous album, Into the Pandemonium. Then, Tony Platt, a producer, and Oliver Amberg, a guitarist, another musician, they convinced Tom G. Warrior to bring the band back together, but none of the other members are brought back into the fold, and Tom is severely, stupidly uninterested in this reunion altogether. Like, he just has absolutely no attachment to this era of Celtic Frost at all. He does not give a fuck. He is collecting a paycheck. He is letting Amberg do the majority of the work here. And Amberg has decided that the natural progression for Celtic Frost after, like, the more experimental twists and turns of Into the Pandemonium is to strip down the sound big time and go for a very straightforward, kind of sleazy glam metal kind of sound. Very much in the vein of, like, what Motley Crue and Poison and Rat were doing at that time. And the results were catastrophic for the band at the time. I mean, this thing was universally panned by fans and critics alike. And again, still to this day, regarded as one of the worst metal albums ever fucking made. One of the worst rock albums ever made, for that matter. Just like an absolutely clueless, indefensibly terrible record from start to finish. According to the broad majority of people who have listened to this, at least. Personally, I don't think this is quite that bad. I don't know. I've listened to, like, Dungeon Wolf and Tougher Than Nails and Psycho Sinner and Psychosexual, so for me to call this one of the worst albums of all time after having listened to that fucking garbage, I don't think I can do it, but this is fucking arguably a really stupid record, and easily their Celtic Frost's worst record today. Like, it's very easy to see why nobody rushes to the defense of this thing. It's very easy to see why this isn't available to buy or stream anywhere. Like, everyone just wants to forget about this fucking album. It's just kind of clumsy and weird, and it's not even so much because it's Celtic Frost doing glam metal. The shock and horror. It's just like a really badly constructed and poorly thought out record. Maybe if it had been a more gradual switch, kind of like how Ulver went from, like, black metal to, like, experimental synth pop or something like that, maybe then people would have bought into it a bit more, but even then, the songwriting, the production, the performances, it just sounds like a really bad, like, 80s cover band, and they're, like, drunk off their fucking asses, and they can't decide if they want to play Venom or Poison. So they compromise, and they play both at the same fucking time. To the torture and to the disappointment of everyone in the crowd. There are some riffs here and there that maybe wouldn't be out of place on something like Point of Entry from Judas Priest, but, you know, it's still nothing spectacular. This album, at its best, is still very straightforward, generic, one-dimensional, like, cock rock and heavy metal. I'm sure most people want me to just sit here and talk shit about this album for like 20 more minutes or something, but I just don't really have that level of intense hatred for this record. For me, this would be like a 1.5 out of 5. It's definitely a bad record, but I don't know. Is it 0 out of 5 worthy? I'm sure you would like to make that argument, but I've no real interest. It's just a bad record, and the sooner that the world forgets about it and moves on to more interesting music, the better. Next up, we have Vanity Nemesis, released in April 1990 via EMI, RCA, and Noise Records. Definitely a big improvement on Cold Lake. This feels like what Celtic Frost should have released after Into the Pandemonium. It's not quite as weird or as funky, but it does have those more expressive and ambitious flavors and moments while staying true to what Celtic Frost was previously doing. They're sticking pretty close to like traditional heavy metal and thrash metal influences here. Some darker kind of gothic rock influences as well. And there's a part of me wondering if Tom was paying attention to like alternative rock and alternative metal at the time, because I don't know, I can kind of hear some of that sometimes, just like a little bit, just like the tiniest little smidgen spice of influence from Faith No More, just kind of tucked away in the corner. I don't know, whatever. Maybe I'm just full of shit. The point is, Vanity Nemesis, from start to finish, a much stronger record, much more cohesive, much more interesting, much more engaging. Stuff like The Name of My Bride, Phallic Tantrum, The Heart Beneath, Wine in My Hand, it all fits in nicely in between what Celtic Frost was doing onto Ethereon and into the Pandemonium. They're dark, they're moody, they're expressive, they're kind of theatrical in some parts. You know, you have that high-octane metal riffage and guitar noodling and pyrotechnics, but you also have these darker textures and soundscapes. Wings of Solitude even has these more romantic and spacious moments as well that definitely brings to mind some goth rock of the time and some early goth metal. Not all of it works. This Island to Earth, for instance, is a little slow and sluggish for my personal liking, and their cover of David Bowie's Heroes is especially awkward and painful. It just does not work for me. But hey, 2 not-so-great tracks and 10 really good, really entertaining tracks. Fuck it, the math works out fine for me. I'm okay, I'm good, I'm happy. I'm feeling a 3.5 out of 5 on Vanity Nemesis. Frankly, these guys could have done anything after Cold Lake, and it probably would have been a hit, but, you know, c'est la vie, it is what it is. It helps that this is actually a good record. And it's often somewhat overlooked. Like, it's not held in the same regard as... you know, even to make Ethereon and Into the Pandemonium and Morbid Tales. We don't really talk about this album the same way we talk about the other Celtic Frost albums, which is a shame, because it's good. Go check it out. And finally, this brings us to Monotheist, released in May 2006 via Century Media Records. After the release of Vanity Nemesis and some more touring, Celtic Frost would disband again in 1993. They would rejoin in 2000, if I'm not mistaken-ish, and they would also begin development on this album in that time, but it would still take another 6 years for this thing to finally see the light of day. Why did it take that long? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question, but I can tell you this is a great record and a fantastic way for Celtic Frost to officially close things out, to officially end this chapter of this book, to end the book altogether, shall I say. This, even more so than Vanity Nemesis, in my opinion, is a true return to form for Celtic Frost. This thing is so fucking oppressive, unrelentingly heavy and dark. They're embracing doom metal, death metal, black metal, more experimental and avant-garde flavors once again. It's filthy and moody, it takes its time, but it also doesn't fucking waste any. You have stuff like A Dying God Coming into Human Flesh, which is just this really horrific, eerie, tense, like slow-paced, almost like blackened death metal. You have these elongated sections of like haunting vocals and eerie dissonant guitar work and like droning progressions, contrasted with this absolutely gnarly, filthy, extreme metal bombast. It honestly feels like something that like Anal Nathrak would have pulled from one of their records, but like, I guess way less hectic. There's also Ground, which is this very groovy, moody kind of death doom. It kind of sounds like an ancient spirit kind of hanging over your shoulder and just whispering horrible secrets to you. Then there's Progeny, which lays on more of that like classic Celtic Frost brutality, but with some sharp, bulky grooves and rhythms. Domain of Decay, which I would honestly describe as Celtic Frost's take on like full-blown sludge metal, complete with crusty, distorted guitar tones and absolutely bulldozing grooves and rhythms and some wailing guitar screeches and solos. And then there's the 14.5-minute opus of Synagogue Saturnae, which is just like progressive, like blackened doom madness. It is an unrelenting and viciously devastating cut. For me, this is a solid 4.5 out of 5, an incredible record, and an incredible way for Celtic Frost to officially close things out. It is worth noting that Tom G. Warrior, like, he would basically take this formula, the sound of this album, and that would become the basis for his next project, Triptychon, who are also awesome and you should definitely check out. But, you know, officially, Celtic Frost is done. It lives on in a way through Triptychon, but yeah, this was their last album, and you couldn't close out officially on a better note than this. And voila, reviewing every Celtic Frost album. Nice! Now it's your turn to tell me, what's your favorite album from this band? What's your least favorite album from this band? How would you rank everything in their discography? Did I get it right? Did I get it wrong? Did I get it somewhere in the middle? What other bands should I talk about in a video like this in the future? In fact, on that topic, head to the community tab of this channel and vote for reviewing every Bring Me the Horizon album. The Metal Meltdown audience is they're a little mixed on that, but I don't know. I'll do it if that's what y'all want. I don't know. I'll do it. I don't care. Majority rules. This is how democracy works. So pop on over there, cast your vote, or else get fucked. Press this button right here to subscribe. Look, there's more videos. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that just fucking amazing? And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.